All right. See, people are joining. We'll give you a few minutes to join in. Good morning, everyone, as you're coming into the webinar. I'm going to wait for just a few more people to come in. Good morning. I love those. I love those greetings on the chat.
Good morning.
Good morning. I know for maybe some people it's not morning, some of our European friends. Oh, hello from Chicago. It's definitely morning there. All right. Well, we're slowing a little bit in terms of people coming in, so why don't we get started? Thank you all for your patience this morning. We're just in the process of getting things up and running, and we will be ready for you shortly.
I'm back. Hello.
Thank you, Mike. So greetings to all of our participants. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. How do we change how the world evaluates high school students? If that isn't the question of the hour, for sure. The Mastery Transcript Consortium, MTC, is a growing network of public and private schools who are introducing a digital high school transcript that opens up opportunity for each and every student from all backgrounds, locations, and types of schools to have their unique strengths, abilities, interests, and histories fostered, understood, and celebrated. And I'm happy to be with you today. I'm Susie Bell. I am the Senior Director of Member Engagement for the Mastery Transcript Consortium. And before I introduce today's webinar leaders, I just want to highlight some logistics. We want to go forth with some Zoom webinar etiquette and get that all out of the way. So only the speakers today will be featured via video. Participants will be muted. There are two ways to engage during the webinar, through the Q&A and through the chat. If you would like to ask a question of our speakers, please use the Q&A feature to pose your question. Myself and DJ Roth will introduce shortly. We'll be monitoring the Q&A for the questions for Mike Flanagan, who's joined us. If you see a question that you'd like answered, you can upvote that question in the Q&A. We'll do our best in the time we have to address as many of your questions as possible. If you are interested in leaving comments or questions for other participants, you may use the chat feature. Please choose the option all panelists and participants for any questions posed in the chat. But please, for the panelists specifically, please use the Q&A because we may not get to any questions posed in the chat. So now we'd love to know who is joining us today. And so if you could take a minute, use the chat feature to introduce yourselves, highlighting your role and your organization. A lot of people have already been saying good morning, so thank you for that. Our speakers today are two of the key team members managing and directing the development of the transcript: Mike Flanagan, Chief Product Officer, and DJ Roth, Technical Product Manager. Mike oversees the design and development of Mastery Transcript software products, connecting with members and advisors to manage the MTC product roadmap. He is an experienced education technology executive, most recently having served as CEO of the Services Division at the National Association of Independent Schools, where he led a complete redesign and relaunch of their school and student services financial aid platforms. DJ Roth manages the technical aspects of developing the Mastery Transcript platform, bringing together product, design, and development to realize the MTC product roadmap. She brings expertise from over 15 years in technical product and project management in education technology, gained across a wide spectrum of environments, from Ohio State University to McGraw-Hill School Education, and most recently as an operations VP for a startup custom software firm. So I will hand it over now to Mike Flanagan.
Super. Thanks so much, Susie. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I just had a chance to scan some of the folks who are in the chat and the participants, and it's a wonderful mix of familiar names. Hello to everybody out there who who I've met before, and new ones as well. And if you're new, if this is your first time learning about MTC, I want to say welcome. We're going to dive right in. I'm going to hopefully, can I get a thumbs up if the screen is showing slides? DJ or Susie, did they come through?
Yes, it's coming through.
Delightful, great. So we thought it would be interesting today to try and put a different kind of spin on how we talk about products and product development at MTC. And a lot of times when I've heard product leaders talk about the kinds of things that they're building and the kinds of software tools that they're developing, they are very tool centric. They focus a lot on the screen, on kind of what you can click, different buttons and features. We're actually going to try and take a different approach today. And so instead of a traditional agenda, what I wanted to do is start with some expectations. The first is a recognition that your time is precious, especially now. I think all of us have had in the past 6 months a lifetime's worth of Zoom meetings. And so rather than trying to extract every possible minute from this hour that we have on the calendar, if possible, we'd like to give you some of your time back and leave time for Q&A. DJ and I will be teaming up throughout the day. I'm going to be leading the presentation, but DJ and I work closely every day. It's not an exaggeration to say that she's the person I talk to most on our team. And the two of us together kind of have complementary roles in developing our software. And so I'm going to encourage you to ask all kinds of questions, as Susie did via the Q&A feature. And DJ will be taking a lead on responding to those, hopefully in real time. And if you hit us with such a flurry of questions that we can't keep up, we promise that we'll loop back with you either at the end of the talk or via email later. The other thing I want to emphasize is that we're going to talk about strategy first. So if I'm making some assumptions here, which is that if you joined us today, you're at least nominally familiar with MTC and our endeavors, the project. You hopefully have seen the Mastery Transcript before. This is not going to be a deep demo of the transcript itself. What we're going to be doing is talking about what we've learned this past year by using the transcript, and based on what we've learned, what we're going to be doing, as I like to say, what's cooking. Both for this year, and then also like a discussion about what's coming ahead in the future. If you think 3, 5, 10 years out, what might be some of the things that we talk about and work on. And then lastly, we want to make sure that there's opportunities for discussion, Q&A, so that we can get some alignment to make sure that if there's any things that you heard or saw that were confusing, that we can kind of make sure we're on the same page about what we're actually trying to say. So this is the central question for today. You could do actually, when you work on a project like ours, you have the pleasant challenge of having to describe it to people who don't work in education, who don't work in schools. And honestly, you could do a lot worse than using a question like this as kind of the mission statement of MTC. How do we change how the world evaluates high schoolers? How do we take these really, really deeply embedded processes and norms and systems that we've all sort of kind of grown so accustomed to that it's really hard to imagine the world working without them? And how do you then replace them with something altogether new and different? That's really the project we've been working on since we started MTC, since I joined. And what's exciting about now, and especially now if you're just joining us midstream, is that we've kind of gone from this pivot point of, oh, that can't possibly work. There's no way you're going to be able to do this, to actually having just finished the first year of, actually it did, much to my delight and sometimes surprise. We're going to be able to show you we had real students use the Mastery Transcript and actually achieve their goals using it. And we'll talk more in detail about what that actually looks like. So if we're going to talk about this, I want to actually start from the back and work forward. If we're going to talk about how we change how the world evaluates high schoolers, we first have to talk about what we mean by high school. And I would submit to you that the 350, now almost 360, or even 370, we've been growing quickly. The schools that are in our membership have a lot of things in common. And one of the things that they share, I think, to a person is a vision for what high school could or should be. It's a very different vision of what students should learn, everything from 21st century skills to the so-called 4 C's, communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, social emotional learning, metacognition, character, what we used to call whole child development. there's a sense that, yes, academic skills, certainly if you have a student who, is college bound, they need to be prepared to succeed academically in college. But there's a shared understanding that what we want our young adults to have mastered by the time they leave high school is more than just the traditional reading, writing, arithmetic, foreign language, science. And so that's kind of one of the big sort of what high school is. And I think it goes without saying that right now in the current system, there are no spaces for this on the traditional transcript itself. That is, if you had to simplify it, one of our kind of big problems that we're trying to solve. The other thing is sort of how should high schoolers learn? Like, what is the best way to learn? And again, I think what a lot of our schools have in common is a sense that learning should be driven by the learner. I actually made a late change. The original title of this was How Do We Change How the World Evaluates High School Students? But we actually use the word learner by design when we talk about our, the people we're serving at MTC, because student implies sometimes passive. They're receiving information from the teacher whose job is to transmit that information. Learners are owning their own paths. It's an active verb. And so I think that's also very true of the kinds of school models you see in the MTC membership, ones that put learners front and center, have learners working on projects, real world problems, usually in teams, and where possible and sometimes facilitated by technology, pursuing altogether personalized learning paths. I want to also acknowledge and honor the fact that not every one of our member schools is fully implementing a model like this, lock, stock, and barrel. For many schools that join MTC, and perhaps your school if you're considering joining us, and I hope you will, it's kind of a lodestone or a North Star. The goal is to transform into a school that implements these kinds of practices. And it's not an exaggeration to say that for many schools, the blocking issue right now is how the world expects high schoolers to present themselves when they finish high school with traditional transcripts and test scores and such. And it doesn't align super well to this model. So again, that is kind of our big goal, to create a model that allows learners who've navigated a high school that looks like this and hopefully been really successful there to then demonstrate what they've learned really fully. And that requires a different set of tools. And then I guess the last thing I would want to say is like why? Like if the what and the how of the kinds of high schools we serve, what they also have in common is a sense of why they're doing this work. And it's really important. We have a ton of schools in our membership that are very proud of being college preparatory. That they have as their mission ensuring that students, learners are fully prepared to succeed in college, and for obvious reasons, right? But they also all have in common the fact that college itself is not going to be preparedness for career and life. That work needs to start earlier in high school. And I'm going to try and kind of unpack a little bit about what I think that might look like in practice. And then certainly we'll talk about what that looks like on the transcript. At this point, I want to kind of interject. This phrase isn't just progressive education. This is an actual quote I heard once from someone who had heard one of our talks. And this is somebody I had known previously and a former head of a school. And they weren't being dismissive, but they were kind of saying, hey, I think I've heard this story before. This is progressive education. So what is exactly new about this? And I will be the first to admit, as a parent who has sent both of his children to a progressive high school and been really delighted with that path, I probably am a little bit sort of defensive about the value of progressive education and what it means for students. But I think one of the reasons that sometimes what some of that phrase can raise a little bit of hackles is that progressive education can sometimes be conflated with an expectation of softness or lack of rigor, or even a certain sense of kind of, if you're really allowing me to get edgy here, kind of indulgence or lack of practicality. And that in turn kind of starts raising a lot of issues about equity. Oh, well, that's nice for certain kinds of kids, but other kinds of kids need practical skills. And hopefully you can hear in my tone that I'm not agreeing with that statement, that I'm trying to pose it to be provocative. And I think what's really interesting is that when you look at the mastery learning schools that we're serving and that are joining our growing network, here's a little thought experiment. This is a description of a set of actual schools. They have learners work in small teams. They work on real world projects. There's no memorization in these schools. Everything is open book. You can literally Google anything you want or use any kind of other tools at your disposal. They don't have instructors giving lectures. They have mentors who work with the teams. When they encounter problems, they answer questions, they give them coaching, they suggest areas where they might kind of try different techniques or go elsewhere to learn more. And they also have very explicitly a try, fail, learn model. So instead of learning first and then being able to apply it, they encourage them to roll up their sleeves and dive right in, start trying it. And then if you get to a point where you get stuck, if you hit a failure point, that's your opportunity where you're most primed to learn something new. And none of this is new for any of us who kind of look at cognitive science, the relationship between that kind of like failure point and being willing and open to learn new things. And then lastly, they don't do exams. They don't ask you to memorize and regurgitate information. Everything that they do assessment-wise is based on presentations and defenses. The teams get up, they say, this is the work that we've done, and we're going to defend it. So what I would submit to you is that this description could be any number of really, really progressive schools, probably high schools given the level of material in the country. But in this case, it's not actually. What I'm describing here are the curriculum and approaches of 4 so-called coding boot camps that have been wildly successful. And what the reason these programs have been really successful is that they are laser focused and ruthlessly practical on preparing people to actually do something of value in the real world. In this case, it's coding. But I am not suggesting the only thing of value is coding. There's a lot of other things you can do. But this is what these folks have happened to focus on. And I think it's really interesting that because they literally started with a blank page and did what we all hope to do, which is backwards design from goals backward into curriculum and technique, this is what they landed on. And yes, it does look a lot like progressive education models, but it's ruthlessly practical. And in many cases, it's extremely results focused because several of these organizations, and I'm not endorsing this model, but for better or worse, their business model depends entirely on their students being able to get full-time employment because that's how they get paid. They don't actually charge tuition. So again, just as a little thought experiment, wanted to hopefully kind of poke a little stick into the concept of the relationship being certain kinds of techniques and their practicality. So the next question then is, if we think about high school and what it means, there's also the question of what does it mean to evaluate? This, by the way, is not a formal research framework. Nobody did a PhD thesis on this. This is like Mike Flanagan thinking about stuff in advance of this talk. I want to put a real asterisk or a caveat on that. But what I would submit to you is that when you look at traditional evaluation models, most of them can be placed somewhere on a map like this. Some are more concise, some are more expansive. Some are symbolic and some are descriptive. Symbolic and descriptive simply means, symbolic is shorthand, right? It's you're capturing the thing itself. Stoplights are symbolic. Speed limit signs arguably are symbolic. Speeding tickets tend to be more descriptive. There's a lot of narrative there about how fast you were going, where specifically, and what kind of car and license plate. And so the degree to which we're kind of representing the thing itself is more descriptive versus shorthands are symbolic. And a lot of the traditional models that we see can be mapped sort of to models like this. Standardized test scores are probably the kind of je ne sais quoi, or no, that's not the right phrase. The ne plus ultra, there we go. You can tell I didn't actually study French. They are sort of the perfect distillation of symbolic and concise, which is why they are extremely attractive to folks that are doing high volume processing in admissions offices. We could spend a lot of time unpacking each of these. I actually think we could have a really good, almost seminar length discussion about whether I've mapped these appropriately. In the lower right corner, I put the idea of performances or demonstrations. The college essay, frankly, is a demonstration. It basically challenges people, hey, write something and, not too long on this topic, and then we'll read it and pretty quickly figure out whether you can write. The challenge, of course, to this, and I think we've all seen this in practice, is that issues of authenticity, the more concise you get, well, there's 2 issues with concision. One, in this issue of the essay, there's issues of authorship. Was this coached or consulted? there's plenty of issues known with standardized test scores. One of them, frankly, is that they very often are a black box, which is to say we don't really know what the student mastered or did not. We just know that a certain score is good and a certain score is not. And I think a real question of that is if you were to go, and I'm not picking on admissions officers at all because they are one of our closest partners in this work, but I actually think if you went to anybody, even in the world of education, other than calculus teachers and said, hey, what's the difference between calculus AB and calculus BC? Most of them would just say, well, BC is harder, right? Like that's sort of the expectation. Similarly, what's the difference between a 3 or a 5 on an AP test for calculus BC? Well, the 5 is better. So that's like the ultimate in kind of a symbolic representation. On the other side, we have portfolios. By the way, a lot of times when we do sort of 2x2 matrices like this, we're implying that what's in the upper right corner is somehow the best. That is not how I did this. I had to choose. So I decided to do this from the perspective of folks who read lots of college applications. What are their preferences? They definitely have, they told us directly, they have strong preferences for things that are concise and things that are symbolic because they're easily ingested. Narrative comments and portfolios are the counterexample, right? They're much more expansive. They're much more descriptive, as in the case of narrative. The problem, of course, with these is that they require time. And in some cases, specifically portfolios, they require subject matter expertise that the readers may not actually have. So again, I want to emphasize here that I'm not indulging in kind of cheap binaries where, descriptive is good and symbolic is bad. That's not the case. Symbolic, there's real advantages. Going back to my previous example, I may not know the exact difference in a student's skill level between a 4 and a 5 on an AP exam in a particular subject. But that's kind of the point. I don't have the expertise to assess that. And that shorthand in certain contexts is very valuable. What you see here is that I've tried to put MTC in the center of this. This is where I'm kind of pivoting from theory to practice and kind of taking a short train stop through philosophy here. But when you think about MTC and like what we're trying to do with our design is deliberately a synthesis that tries to find the sweet spot between these different elements. Okay, not too hot, not too cold, not too symbolic, not too descriptive, a lot of detail, but hopefully concise and easy to read. So that to me is sort of the game for us when we think about what are we trying to change and what are we trying to change with evaluation. It's trying to give users something new that addresses some of the known shortcomings or issues of some of these other approaches. And then that brings us to kind of our big question, which is then if you know what you're trying to do and who you're trying to serve and why, how do you actually do it? How do you actually effect that change? I would submit to you there's 2 ways we do this. One is our organizational strategy. I'm not going to read this to you, but what I will say is that we spent a lot of time organizationally trying to think about like, what is our unique contribution? Like this, we are far from the only player in the ecosystem of school innovation or educational technology. There's a lot of different big bubbles of the Venn diagram that overlap in the place that MTC sits. But we do think we have a unique one. And it's our job to find something that nobody else is doing it and then execute on it really, really ruthlessly. And the way we're going to execute on that, but ruthless for me is a good thing when it comes to execution towards a goal. And that means like doing the stuff that we do uniquely well. And we are very much building tools. We want to put systems in the hands of end users that make their job easier. And in this case, it's this job of applying a different kind of mastery assessment methodology and then relaying the output of that to different sets of stakeholders. We also recognize, and I alluded to this before, that for the many schools in our network that are not yet fully mastery learning kind of oriented or enabled, we want to help them on that journey. We want to empower them to get there. And then it's really important to point that the last 2 elements here, like our core competencies, are not actually us, the team of MTC, but it is the network itself. We are a more effective and richer organization. We have more to offer because we now have 350 plus members contributing to our work than when we first started with a founding cohort of 15. And those kinds of network effects and what we're doing really resonate in the products that we're building and in our theory of those products. And I'll talk about what that might look like in practice in just a bit. So that's the first thing. We have a really, you define your strategy, you define where you're going to play. And the other thing you do is you actually start doing stuff, and you change the world in our case by trying to give it something new. And last year was a really milestone year for us because we did give it something new. We gave it the first version of the Mastery Transcript, and it's a real thing now. Our pilot cohort, we had 4 high schools that used the Mastery Transcript. For the students at those high schools, they ranged from a high school that is a startup with a single senior to a well-established project-based learning school that has over 50 seniors. The seniors that used our transcript to apply to college, it was their only transcript. So that was really important for us to say, we really wanted to draw a line to say, you know, this isn't a supplement, this isn't an addendum. I think I'm confident in saying we could have had a much larger pool of adopters, of users, if we had said, oh yeah, you just add it on to what you're already doing. But we made a design choice not to do that because we really wanted to, for lack of a better word, force the discussion and force our users to engage with what we have built. Over 120 colleges received it and 85 unique acceptances. So some of our students got into more than one school, which is great. Many of the schools that students applied to were extremely selective. And so as with any transcript, sometimes kids didn't get in, and that's to be expected too. Another thing that we did coming right off of the pilot season is we then invested in some real structured interview-based research with stakeholders in higher ed, admissions leaders, enrollment management leaders, junior level folks who were kind of reading lots of admissions folders. And we learned a lot along the way. A couple things we learned in the course of the pilot, particularly formats and compliance. There's just expectations, organizational needs that these folks have out of what they need from a transcript. It's got to have certain dates on it. It's got to be in certain file formats. And the nice thing about our pilot is that we were able to go to our admissions officers and say, hey, you tell us what you'll need and we will give it to you. Like there's value in only having 4 high schools and 60 transcripts out there. We can pivot really quickly. And so we did. We were able to give them things in the course of the pilot. The other thing that came out really loud and clear as a result of the research is just context is everything for these readers. We knew that going in. We knew the importance of context, but now we've got a much more nuanced handle of the kinds of context that we can implement. And I will talk about that shortly. I'll talk about what that looks like in practice. So that's the pilot year. DJ, I'm gonna just interject right here real quickly and see, have any questions come up in the Q&A? I'm pretty good at juggling multiple screens. I'm now speaking to everybody else on the webinar, but I know from personal experience that if I try and read all the questions in real time, there's no way I'll be able to maintain my train of thought. So either Susie or DJ, any questions specific to what I just covered that you think would be best if I answered now?
Mike, there's a question. Can you address how the design is explicitly anti-racist? What leadership and decision-making practices ensure this?
Oh man, that's an amazing question. So, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge that like any organization, you know, kind of our own work, you know, our DEI work here, diversity, equity, inclusion work, justice as well, is ongoing, right? So there is no single version of the transcript that is going to be like the platonic ideal of a perfectly anti-racist tool. What I can say is a couple of different things. If you go back to some of the evaluation models that I was talking about previously, and I will use the concept of grades and GPA as a very simple placeholder. One of the things that it became incredibly clear to us when we were doing higher ed research is that because they are sort of closed and symbolic, the GPA that a learner receives from a given institution is effectively meaningless without understanding the institution that issued it. And unfortunately, given the way that our K-12 education system is set up right now in the United States, it means that it's really an index of haves and have-nots. What kinds of kids get to go to certain schools that readers of transcripts and consumers of GPAs look at and say, oh, that's a GPA from a quote unquote good school. If we are trying to disrupt one thing in this model, it's the idea that learners at any school are capable of exemplary work. And the assessment of that work should not be indexed to others' perceptions of whether or not that school is a good school. Now, how do you get around that? Right? That's the challenge. One of the ways that we do that, and it's probably hard to see here on our little transcript thing, but we have a full kind of walkthrough of this on the website. And I also should say that any questions about the transcript, if you want to learn more about it, we will make opportunities available to you to kind of give you that deep dive demo. We want to make sure that learners have an opportunity to kind of include evidence in context when they are being assessed. To say, oh, my school says I have mastered this skill, but for whatever reason, if you, the reader, don't trust my school, you don't think it has a good reputation, you can actually see the work that I did. And so that is sort of a step that we are making where we're not assessing learners on where they come from, but what they actually do. Is that the entire game? No. We could have an incredible long-form discussion about just that. But those are the kinds of, hopefully if I've underscored one thing, it's that we are very mindful of that. And we're continuing to kind of take feedback and iterate. So that's a great question. Thank you, Susie, for flagging it and pulling it to the fore.
I don't know if you'd like to answer a couple more. We do have some that have been generated by your answer. First, the first cohort of schools used only the Mastery Transcript. Will we require that that same setup going forward? And
that's a good question. I could see. I think the honest and fair answer is we don't know. This year, and I will talk about that in a moment, we are continuing to use the Mastery Transcript as the sole transcript of record. But again, the design choice there was to force the question of acceptance, to see if we could get real data about whether or not this transcript worked as a standalone. It seems reasonable to ask, hey, if you do that a certain number of times, you kind of prove that point. So now what else could you do with a transcript like this? One of the things that I am very interested in doing is collecting more data and performing more research so that readers can have confidence that students who master on our transcript certain sets of essential skills, we can demonstrate that those skill sets are, for the purposes of whatever kind of evaluation you're doing, are as good as or better than traditional grades and GPA. If you're going to do that kind of comparison side by side, you actually need side by side. You need to be able to evaluate learners using both methodologies. So I'm certainly not closing the door on that. I'm just letting you know that for this year at least, we're continuing to push the issue of, hey, let's get the transcripts out there. Let's make sure people really engage with them. We are making a conscious choice to have smaller numbers of transcripts out there. In other words, we would have more adoption if we used it as a supplement. But we're going to get better data because people have to look at it to make their judgment. And by the way, when I say better data, I don't always mean compliments. Like, it's okay for us to have admissions officers who said, I don't understand what this is about, or this doesn't make sense to me at first glance. We need that information, and we're just very fortunate that we're set up in such a way that we can act on it very quickly. It makes all the difference in the world to go to somebody and say, hey, we're giving this to you. It's still very much work in progress. If you have feedback, let us know. And then to act on that in real time and show them that you're actually listening, it creates really powerful kind of positive feedback loops in terms of building the relationships with those users. So I'm going to move ahead to what's coming in the next year. And then I promise we're going to leave ample time for more Q&A and discussion in just a bit. So new for this year. We have in the hands, over the past year we've been building this, but we literally are in the process of releasing it to the entire network of member schools, a new set of tools to actually build transcripts. Building a transcript is interesting because that was very much the project when you're dealing with pilot schools. They are taking seniors who are basically done with high school and they are building them a transcript from the ground up so that they can use it in real time. Our real goal is for students to grow transcripts, right? To start the process of thinking very mindfully about what kinds of competencies that their school wants them to master, how they're going to do that, in what order, with what kinds of work. Obviously, this is all happening in the context of the school's program offerings. They've got mentors and advisors. But we do actually see this as a long-term process. And the main thing is that the new tool is extremely scalable. And what I mean by that is not just that you can have lots of users on it at once without it crashing, although it certainly will do that, but it gives you tools, and it gives all the different kind of user groups we serve tools to make it easier to manage the processes like this with larger numbers. And so here's an example of that. Every user has some form of dashboard as their landing page when they come in. This happens to be the dashboard for a school administrator who's coming in and looking at a particular school. I know that the font can be a little small and fuzzy. I have a pretty high resolution monitor, and sometimes Zoom doesn't play well with that. But each of those little color-coded cards represents sort of a major area of school activity. Who are the teachers at your school? Who are the educators? What courses do you offer? What are your sets of mastery credits? By the way, if you're new to MTC discourse, mastery credit is our kind of term of art for competencies or skills. We are trying to really embrace a format that supports all different kinds of schools and doesn't require them to kind of adopt our own language. So we chose something that was deliberately neutral. But the vast majority of schools that we serve probably think of these as competency models. And then also groups of learners, so on and so forth. So again, all the information you need, landing page, hopefully pretty intuitive. Any one of these you can drill in and either review the information or kind of manipulate it, update it, do whatever you need to do to get your work done. This is the landing page for an actual learner. And learners have dashboards too. This is one of the bigger changes between traditional transcripts are static reports, right? You generate transcript out of your SIS system and it spits it out. And then maybe you apply a school seal to it and have somebody sign it. But they're, at the end of the day, programmatic and pretty passive. One of the first things we talked about was the idea of putting learners at the center of their learning process. It's also true of their transcript creation. We definitely envision the transcript as an advisory tool. We want learners day one to understand how their work is being visualized, how it's being presented to the outside world, and to have them be mindful of that and to make choices to say, oh, okay, I could go this way, I could go that way. Oh, it looks like even though I think I've been doing a lot of work in this area, my transcript doesn't quite reflect that in terms of the skills that I've mastered. What do I do with that? What information can I have? And the same goes for those learners advisors, having that information at hand. It's also really important to know that we are taking pains to try and break both learners, schools, and readers out of the mindset that when it comes to the mastery of skills, the goal is to get them all. The goal is more is always better. The schools that we're serving right now, especially the schools in the pilot, have curriculum, programs, profiles that make it really explicit that they're giving students a lot of latitude. Okay, if I have an area of particular strength or passion, I'm going to be encouraged, I'm going to be given time, space, and resources to go deeper in that than would normally be allowed in a high-performance high school curriculum, where increasingly your so-called top students are being directed to a very narrow band of courses with similarly narrow sort of assessments coming out of them at the end. To put it a different way, we think we will be successful if the students from mastery learning high schools who have extremely different profiles when they are performing at the highest possible levels. Whereas right now in the traditional model, students that are performing at the highest levels have transcripts that look really, really uncannily similar to one another. And then we're also building in tools to encourage communication, collaboration between learners and advisors. There's a lot of activity that's happening to build a mastery transcript. Evidence gets reviewed, credits get approved. Sometimes evidence doesn't get accepted. Sometimes it's sent back with feedback. The schools that we're serving, all of them have different tools and models to kind of manage these processes. We are trying to align the transcript to those and the transcript tools. And we're going to talk about how we're also kind of going upstream a little bit to build some of these. Most importantly too, one of the main questions we get from new schools or schools new to using the transcript is, what are other schools doing? Some schools come to us with a very intact portrait of a graduate, very well thought through. They've done the backwards design process. They have really nice competency models. Others are starting that journey and they're really eager to see exemplars or analogs. we now make it very easy for you to go in and see the credit areas of other schools. This is an example of those network effects that I was talking about. The more schools we have using the system, the more examples there are, the more best practices, and also the more data there is. This is a first step towards kind of optimizing the work, making it easy. There's a lot of really interesting technologies that are really available to us now that weren't available 3-5 years ago. I'll give you a real world example of that. Right now, what we have is a couple of schools that are building credit architectures. It's not an exaggeration to say that if by say this time next year, we have 50 to 100 schools that have built out their credit architectures, we will probably have created the single largest repository of high school competency models in kind of one place, and that are kind of mastery learning oriented and are really being mindful about best practices. There's enormous value in having that all in one place. Right now, a lot of the descriptors are all very text-based. They're descriptions of what students have to do. A lot of Bloom's taxonomy language in those. But once you have large sets of machine-readable text in very structured formats, there's a lot of interesting tools you can use on the software side to kind of look at that and learn from it, find associations, find commonalities, do extrapolations. And so I'm trying very hard not to use the word AI because it's a buzzword, but I'm talking about AI. And we're gonna have, I think there's some really interesting opportunities for us to do that over the next couple of years. So let's talk about the year ahead. What's cooking? I happen to be a pretty avid home chef. And so my goal is, like, if you walk into the kitchen and look at what's on the counter, you should be able to tell what's going on. This is what's on our counter. We are tripling the number of schools that are using the transcript this year, more than tripling the number of students. We are now trying very hard, I don't want to say automate, but definitely expedite and rationalize and streamline the outreach process for admissions offices. Last year was our goal to speak to every school before they got the transcript, like the kind of a goal of no surprises. That's a stretch goal. It's hard. We didn't always know where the transcripts were headed because, again, we aren't the ones sending them. Learners are, and learners, as you all know if you work in schools, they're 18 years old. They're making decisions sometimes at the 11th hour. And so no matter how good a job we were doing, kind of knocking on doors and doing kind of a retail-based outreach process, there's always going to be some instances where you're a little behind the curve. So this year we've added tools that actually allow learners, encourage learners even, to start building their school lists in the system to say, I am thinking of applying to these 5 colleges. And in turn, as we reach out to the colleges and kind of build relationships with them, our goal is to then reflect that back into the system. It's not an exaggeration to say that a year from now, or even by the end of this academic year, if DJ is applying to 5 colleges, she should be able to go in and as she adds them to the system, see at a glance which ones already have accepted a mastery transcript, which ones we've not talked to yet, but maybe over the next couple of weeks, you'll see that kind of change because we're responding to what she's telling us about the need to talk to those schools. So those tools are in there, really exciting. And then just blocking and tackling. Our goal is to make sure that schools that use the transcript, it's an aspirational goal. We aspire to them not to have to retype in any information, starting with the basics, right? Just kind of rostering, students, course lists. We want those to flow from the systems that are already in place. And we're sending member surveys out as we speak to get a better inventory of what systems are there. And then I would talk before earlier about like what we've learned by doing the research and by talking to stakeholders in college admissions offices. They talked a lot about context. And for us, these are kind of the big 4 areas that when we talk about what's going to be new on the transcript reader, they want to know, okay, so this learner mastered these credits, but out of what, or like as part of what? So being able to show like a whole overview, a landscape of all the different credits a school offers, and then being able to say, this learner, they are here, is really critical. And the good news is that we have all the data we need to do that. Any school that's generating a transcript already has told us every single credit they offer and any kind of like relationship between those, whether they're category relationships or level relationships. Another big question is, can I see multiple profiles of learners all at once? It's good for me to know that Mike is a senior and his profile looks like this, but what does DJ's profile look like? Now, there's different contexts in which it would be okay and not okay to use this. If you have 5 students from a single high school applying to the same college, it might make sense to expedite that view and give a learner in that college a look at all 5 students. It would not make sense for us to include information for a college of students that aren't applying there. It might make sense, however, to anonymize a couple of different learner profiles and incorporate them elsewhere as kind of an overview of how to read mastery transcripts from school X. So these are some of the different things we're thinking about and playing with. We know from direct experience that schools colleges really liked what we had done with school profiles, which is integrate them into the transcript tool itself and include lots of contextual information about how to read the mastery transcript from this school. What we are now doing is taking what is admittedly a long kind of text document and pulling information and finding opportunities to embed it directly into the view of the transcript reader itself. And then lastly, there's just a lot of usability things we know we can add to make it more easy to use. We had the advantage of being able to talk to most schools last year before they had to look at a transcript. So we were able to kind of give them some cues and set expectations. But we know that over time that won't be scalable. And so our goal is to create a system where even if you've never seen one before and we think it's pretty usable, but let's say you don't, let's say you disagree and you're not sure what's happening, with a click you can open self-guided tours or contextual information about what you're actually seeing on the screen. So those are kind of some of the things we're cooking on. Longer term priorities. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A, so I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly. But the main idea here is that our core product offering started with the key question of, what we started, the discussion around. How do we demonstrate to the outside world what learners can actually do? And that's the transcript. That's the Mastery Transcript product. We also then, as I just demonstrated, want to be able to answer member schools' questions about what other schools are doing in terms of competency models, frameworks, portraits of a graduate. And the transcript builder now has that technology, again, browsing, comparing, contrasting, looking at what other people are doing. What's really interesting for us now is what about all the upstream stuff? I talked before about our stretch goal being able to have integrations in place with various learning management systems and student information systems so that everything just flows seamlessly into the transcript. But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of learning management systems or student information systems today that simply do not see the world of high school the way our members see it. They see the world in terms of courses and grades. Courses are broken into units. Units are broken into assignments. Everything gets a letter or a number and then all rolls up to an average. That is not the kind of the mental or the architectural model for how our schools think about their data or think about their assessments. And so there's a lot of upstream questions like those that we think we're now in a position to answer. And over the next couple of years, we're going to, starting this year, we're going to be building out and piloting some tools and technologies that actually help schools do the work of mastery learning. And we're pretty excited about those. So that hopefully has taken us kind of on a journey from the super philosophical, what we're trying to do and why, to the super concrete of, hey, our roadmap is going to be this year, and we're also going to be piloting different kinds of tools. And what I want to do now is kind of make good on what I said earlier about being respectful of time and also answering questions. So I'm going to pause myself and say, DJ and Susie, let's kind of open it up for more kind of dialogue and questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. There's a few questions about the, sort of the context around colleges and the pressure that they're facing, but also, changing, a lot of things changing around, the SAT and things like that. And I'm wondering if through that, you can also answer a third question, which is, are colleges willing to take the time to review the mastery transcript that, people might assume takes a little bit more time to do that? And then within that context of the changing environment of college admissions, how does this really impact the whole ecosystem around that?
Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces there. So I'll start answering a couple of those, and then I'll trust to you kind of redirect me if I skip any. So I think the question of time is really a key one. We've been very forthright that the first time you look at a Mastery transcript, we're not assuming it's going to be as quick a process as looking at a traditional transcript is for college readers. But that's because the traditional transcript is leveraging literally decades of use and thousands of, if not tens of thousands of repetitions for the people that scan it today. The other reason is that, frankly, it doesn't contain that much information. Like, it is really pegged to the symbolic end of that framework I used before. It's very shorthanded. We think the better kind of measure for us is not, how long does it take one to read a Mastery transcript versus or traditional transcript, but rather, how much time do college readers spend looking at a college application, and how much of that sort of mind share or time share can we kind of earn back from them, right? We know from talking to college readers that they sometimes will kind of voice surprise and delight because they realize, oh, there's stuff that you're telling me that I would normally have had to go elsewhere to figure out, right? Why do we ask for lists of extracurriculars? Why do we ask for, kind of recommendations, not just from teaching faculty, but from perhaps coaches or advisors in other areas? Because we're trying to understand what previously or sometimes kind of intangibles, or kind of trying to make certain kinds of tacit skills or qualities explicit. I think when the light bulb has gone on for college readers, it's been the realization like, oh, you're going to take a lot more of that MTC and you're going to put it in the foreground. I think on the flip side of that, one of our projects will be taking this set of schools that certainly we worked with in the first go around, and just I saw a question come up about this in the pilot. Our 4 schools two of them were public, actually 3 were public schools, and then 1 was an independent school, and they serve a really kind of diverse group of students, everything from kind of students who live kind of in the suburbs of Seattle to students who live in Vermont, and their school has a really big refugee population, very big ESL. So I think it was a pretty nice kind of, given it was just 4 schools, it was a pretty nice cohort. But where I'm going with this is that those 4 schools have really different models today for how they articulate what their students are expected to learn. We decided as a design choice that we would not ask schools to rewrite or to norm those models to kind of MTC standards, because A, that's kind of hard for us to write, and B, we want people to use it kind of where they are. Our goal over time will be to kind of harmonize or create reference points so that readers who are looking at transcripts, not from a single school, which in practice is what they're going to see today. It would be pretty hard for me to imagine a scenario this year in which a reader from a college gets like a Mastery transcript from like 4 different sending schools. They're just not geographically concentrated enough. But that will happen, at some point next year or the year after. And at that point, we want we want the transition process across different school models to be as smooth as possible. And that's where some of those tools that allow us to find commonalities between the descriptions that schools are using, and to use kind of technologies like tagging and other things to kind of make it easier for people to navigate. Great questions, though. We talked before about the changing landscape. I will say this, we've never tried to set up the goal of MTC to be explicitly like oppositional or antagonistic to anything other than the traditional transcript. So, when it comes to whether students do or don't take standardized tests or which tests, like we're kind of agnostic on that. However, it is impossible to ignore the fact that right now, the testing industry is being massively disrupted by world events. Students simply don't have access to the kinds of tests they might have used this year to apply to college. Even before the arrival of COVID and that disruption, there was a lot of disruption in certain sectors of higher ed based on the Operation Varsity Blues scandal and concern about, wow, extracurriculars, essays, like what here is authentic, what is not. I'm not going to put too much weight on any one of these things, except to say this is a really productive time to be talking to college readers about what else they might want or what else they could be using when it comes to assessing what students can actually do. There is always going to be kind of a level of comfort and familiarity with like tools that you're used to whenever you do work. And so one of our challenges early last year was getting people to be open to looking at new ways of doing things. There's a lot more openness around that now. And that's not because of anything we did. It's just because the world changed very, very quickly.
There's a question about, this is a great question, that you talked a bit about the Mastery Transcript being seen as progressive, you know, sort of a real nice fit with progressive education. But there might be a perspective that many students, teachers, parents may see it as not rigorous or appropriate for gifted students. Has there been any research on the impact of Mastery Transcript on gifted students?
I think that's a wonderful question. I think by framing it as have we done any research yet, I think the honest answer is not yet. And I think good research requires kind of a sizable cohort, one that's big enough where you can start to kind of like use statistical techniques to kind of get some of the noise out of the system. And right now, any work we would be doing is anecdotal. I would say though that one of the things that makes me very optimistic is that if you look at schools that use, for example, capstone projects or defenses, they're almost always featuring those projects as evidence of the highest level work that their students are doing. It's very rare for somebody to say, oh, look, you know, kind of we do capstones, you know, because they're really easy. And capstone projects lend themselves really, really well to the kind of multidisciplinary kind of assessment models where we're looking at kind of cross-domain competencies and things like that. The other nice thing about capstones or independent studies or defenses is that they really value depth, right? So my son, who went to a progressive high school, happened to be kind of an engineer. It's really just what he loves. So for his capstone project, he built an electric car from scratch. Now, granted, that was a pretty unique set of circumstances. He happens to have some hobbies that gave him access to tools and resources to do that. And his school was really supportive too. But the main thing is that if he, the rigor that he wanted to demonstrate in that capstone, it wasn't, oh, well, I want to show that I'm really doing high level work, so I'm going to do 2 capstones or 3. It's you take one and you go really, really deep. And he had other, classmates who took theirs in very, very different directions. So anyway, a lot of different kind of points there. I am overly optimistic. I am, as a whole, optimistic about the flexibility of mastery learning models to serve learners of all different populations. I'm seeing references in the questions to LD, et cetera. I would love to continue those discussions in more detail over time, because I really do think that if you start from the premise that all students are capable of high levels of work, you make the standards of that work very explicit to them, and you put them into an environment where their educators are mentors, advisors, and coaches trying to help them reach that level, as opposed to gatekeepers who are trying to score and sort them. I think you can get really radically different outcomes. I think it is inherently a more equitable model. So I recognize that we're bumping up against our time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I will offer to stay on the chat to answer questions further. I will also offer my own email address, which is flanagan@mastery.org, and encourage, if you'd like to continue the discussion, please do reach out. In particular, I recognize that we did not do a deep dive demo of the transcript. If you joined today hoping for that, we would love to do that for you. So please reach out if you'd like to set that up, and we will have someone on the team make sure that you get that kind of deep dive into what the transcript is, how it works, all those kind of real blocking and tackling kind of things, because we're very proud of what we made. So. Mike,
we've referred folks out to the video that you posted on our website that really gives a great overview, but for a deeper dive for sure. Reach out to any one of us, bell@mastery.org. I'm here as well. We can take you through that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. I know how busy you all are. It's really a privilege to be able to speak with you. And good luck with what we know is a school year like no other. So.
Thank you, everyone.